What is the difference between vigilante justice and murder? Many of you know the simple definition of a vigilante by relating it to your favorite superhero. It's someone who takes care of crime but is not a police officer. In other words, instead of prosecuting by law, they do things based upon their own interpretation of the law or strictly based upon their own beliefs. The dictionary definition of a vigilante and their methods of justice is also known as frontier justice, is extrajudicial punishment that is motivated by the non-existence of law and order or dissatisfaction with justice. What this means is a person outside of the law enforcement who believes someone should have gotten a more harsh punishment will find the perpetrator and attempt to conduct their own form of punishment on them. Most commonly, torture methods, very serious threats, or even murder are used to conduct this. Therefore, there's an extremely big difference between vigilante justice and murder. An example of vigilante justice would be giving a family closure to a violent situation, such as a mother attacking her daughter's rapist. On the other side, an example of vigilante murder would be Trayvon Martin's case. Zimmerman, Trayvon's killer, was a member of the Neighborhood Watch in his home. While on duty, he suspected Trayvon was up to no good, so he took action, but had no clear evidence to do so. After some back-and-forth confrontation and some fighting, Trayvon was shot and killed. This is a vigilante murder because Zimmerman thought he was doing the right thing but had no reason to do so. If you're still wondering what the difference between justice and murder is, justice can be justified. A good reason can be presented to define the actions of a person. Murder, on the other hand, cannot be justified and has no reasoning or evidence to prove the actions of someone besides their thoughts. While vigilante justice may be slightly more acceptable than vigilante murder, neither of the two options are how situations should be handled.
The Flint, Michigan water crisis. The residents of Flint are targets of environmental racism that is still going on today. In 2014, the government, including Michigan's governor, voted to switch Flint's water source to Lake Michigan to save money. Within a year, people found out this water was hazardous and was causing many health issues. There are claims that the government knew about this but did not do anything to save money. Even when people first figured out that this water was not healthy, it took the government 7 days to bring them bottled water. Was this because the government thought that because it's a black, poor community, it did not need to be a priority on their list? Years later, this crisis is still happening today. What is the government doing to help these people?
Hurricane Katrina was such a devastating storm for two reasons. The first being its physical force and inflicted damage specifically in New Orleans. The second is its political aftermath. Beginning with a few days before the storm, people hurried to prepare themselves for the impending storm. Wealthier parts of New Orleans voluntarily left the city and traveled inland to avoid the worst parts of the storm. These were the people who could afford to lose their belongings or even their homes. Insurance in this case was a necessity for those who could afford it. However, that leaves the rest of the population of New Orleans with a life-changing decision they were forced to make. Keep in mind that 26.1% of the population at the time was below the poverty line. This left people with two options: leave their home and all that they worked for, or risk it all and abandon their home with what few belongings they had. A lot of people, knowing the risks of a Category 5 hurricane, stayed and were willing to take their chances at home. Even so, many people were relying solely on the evacuation plan of the town and nourishment from local and state federal government aid programs. Ray Nagin, who was the mayor of New Orleans, was widely criticized for failing to implement his food plan and for ordering residents to a shelter of last resort without any provisions for food, water, security, or sanitary conditions. The most criticized action of Nagin was he delayed his emergency evacuation order until less than a day before Katrina's landfall. This led to hundreds of deaths, since by that time, people could not find their way out of the city. Along with the evacuation plan, there were parking lots full of school buses which Nagin refused to use in the evacuation. When he was questioned as to why he didn't utilize the buses, he explained how there was a lack of drivers as well as insurance liabilities involved.
Hurricane Katrina created big racial tension. Hurricane Katrina to African Americans was confirmation of America's indifference to black lives. They felt like they were being forgotten about because of their race and thought that the government did not care to rescue them. Also, the hurricane helped enhance the present movement against police violence. Black Lives Matter. Many African Americans believe the government did not care to protect or rescue the people of New Orleans because of their race. 71% of blacks said that New Orleans would have been better prepared if it was a wealthier city with more whites, and 76% said the federal government would have responded faster. Also, media covering the Katrina victims started making exaggerated claims of violence among Katrina victims, as well as grossly inaccurate reports of crime and disorder. That made the black people in New Orleans believe that the government thought that all black people are thugs and criminals. Storm also created a big racial divide. For example, 65% of white respondents blamed residents of the mayor for being trapped in New Orleans, and half of all whites said that people who broke into stores and took things were mostly criminals, compared to 77% of blacks who said that they're mostly desperate people trying to find a way to survive. Because of this, black satisfaction with society dips from a steady 41% in 2005 to 37% in 2006 to 30% in 2007. So the environmental racism during the Katrina storm created black residents to lose hope for equality in society.